go. All right. So hi everyone. Welcome to Progressively Decoupled React and Drupal 8. I'm Kemane. Today we're going to talk a little bit about React, what it is, why you might use it, and how you can use it with Drupal. Before we get started, I'll introduce myself. I'm a web developer at Texas Creative. We're a full-service advertising agency here in San Antonio. We have an in-house Drupal development team, and we've built sites for the San Antonio River Authority, Jefferson Bank, the Tobin Center for the Performing Arts, and a few more. This is my first year working with Drupal, and I have a little over 2 years of WordPress and full stack experience, working with things like Angular, React, and Node. We recently built a Drupal site with an appointment scheduling calendar for a medical practitioner, and determined using React would be the best way to go to speed up development time and give the user a highly interactive user interface. So for today's session, I've prepared a similar demo with the same full calendar component. Before we get into all that though, we'll do a quick overview of what we'll talk about. So we're going to look at the required modules for Drupal to work with React as an API. And then we'll go into the ModelViewController Architecture, what it is, and where React and Drupal both lie. And then the differences between progressively and fully decoupling a Drupal site. After that, we'll get into React, cover the core concepts, take a quick tour around the demo site to see React in action. And then after looking at the demo site, we'll come back, cover some core concepts of Redux, and then we'll also look at that. You do not need Redux to work with React, but they do go very well together for large-scale applications. So the required Drupal modules to work with React are views and RESTful web services. The RESTful web services also has a dependency on the serialization module. You're going to hear me say API many times throughout the session. If you're unfamiliar with the term, it stands for Application Programming Interface. It's a communication protocol between the client and the server to simplify building client-side software. So that's what the views and RESTful modules allow us to do, is set up our Drupal site as an API that React can then go to and consume that API. That allows us to use things like GET requests, POST requests, delete, and update. Sorry about that. Has anyone here not heard of React? No. Anyone not familiar with the views or REST modules? No. All right. So. All right. Quick overview of the ModelViewController Architecture. It's an architectural pattern that has existed for a long time in software engineering. Almost all languages use it with some slight variation, but conceptually it remains the same. The model is responsible for managing the data and receives user input from the controller. The view is what makes up the visual representation that the user sees, and the controller responds to the user input and performs interactions on the data and passes it to the model. Because it's set up like this, it allows you to split your teams up into front-end developers and back-end developers who can work. A back-end developer can design the structure and interaction without needing a front-end, and a front-end developer can design the layout and style without needing the back-end. In the case of a Drupal site, the SQL database is essentially your model. The admin UI, where you're going to set everything up, is your controller, and the twig templates are your view. In a progressively decoupled or decoupled at all, it's a little different because Twig and React will work together for the view, but Drupal will still be your model and controller. Before we get into fully or progressively decoupled, we'll just quickly talk about traditional or coupled. That is when the CMS knits together the front end and back end, working off the same application. Developers and content managers make adjustments to the back end while users interact with the front end, but both are experiencing, viewing, and interacting with the same system. As you can see, the page is rendered by the CMS, but in a fully decoupled site, or also known as headless, the front end and back end are completely separated. Developers and content managers will only work in the CMS, and the view will be something completely different, such as a React app or Angular app, even a Vue app. And you connect those two through an API, sending HTTP requests from the client to the server, or vice versa. So in that case, Drupal is solely your data store and plays no part in determining what the user experience consists of. That's all going to be provided by React or whatever your Vue library is. In a progressively decoupled situation, so quite often you don't need to go fully decoupled unless you're maybe building like iOS or Android app. But in progressively decoupled, you might just want one or two highly interactive elements on a few pages of your website. So in that case, it makes more sense to use React along with Twig and have Twig still output the primary, like the majority of the content for your site, and then React will handle those few interactive elements that you need. And this approach is called progressively decoupled. And if you've built themes before, you've likely used jQuery to provide user experience enhancements. This is essentially the same thing, only using React instead of jQuery. It's supposed to be there. All right, React. So everyone's heard of React, yes? A little bit about it. It's an open source JavaScript library developed by Facebook for building interactive and fast single-page applications which can change data without a page reload. The main purpose is to be fast, scalable, and simple. It's just a JavaScript library and not a framework, therefore it's often not a complete solution and you'll need to include other packages, but there's a large ecosystem which you can use to extend your base library. The main reason React is fast is because it uses a programming concept called the virtual DOM, where a virtual representation of the user interface is stored in memory and synced with the real DOM. This approach enables the declarative API of React. You tell React what state you want the UI to be in, and it'll make sure the DOM matches that state. This abstracts out attribute manipulation, event handling, and manual DOM updating that you would otherwise have to do. Any view changes you make are first reflected to the virtual DOM, then an efficient difference algorithm compares the two, and if the state has changed from the previous to the current, then it'll go and update only the things that need to be updated without doing a full page reload. And that's where you get the speed. React is pretty. It is written in ES6, or typically written in ES6. But at the end of the day, it's just JavaScript. ES6 brings in new syntax and new features to make your code more modern and more readable. It allows you to write less code and do more. Some new syntax and features are things like arrow functions, array and object iterators, promises are built in, and asynchronous await functions. Oh yeah. So with React, we're going to quickly look at components, state and props, component lifecycle methods, and then I don't know why that's keeps turning off. So React is based on component design. Everything is a component, which makes everything independent and reusable. A component is a JavaScript class or function that contains all the code necessary to output a part of the user interface. They accept arbitrary inputs known as props and return React elements that provide HTML markup and related behaviors you see on the screen. So you can kind of think of components like Lego blocks. They're just small independent things that you combine together to make a large application in the end. You might have a button, checkbox, or drop-down component that will then, you'll create a wrapper component composed of those smaller components, and then you write another higher level component to wrap those components. And it goes on like that until you have one single root component that you render to the web page. Components are kind of similar to Twig templates, where you might have a page.html.twig that renders field Twig files and node Twig files. But Twig is a syntax extension of HTML, so your JavaScript functionality is limited, while JSX is a syntax extension of JavaScript, so you have full JavaScript functionality. And it allows you to write HTML in your JavaScript files. And if anyone has any questions throughout, just feel free to ask. So component props, like I said, they're arbitrary inputs you can pass to your components, and you'd pass that like an HTML attribute. But it's not HTML, it's JavaScript. So not only can we pass strings, but we can pass numbers, objects, arrays. In this example, we have a stateless functional component that just takes in name property and then returns an H1. So our welcome component here will return an H1 that says hello Texas Camp. And below that we have two button components where you create the function once and then you can just reuse your element with different properties to create two different buttons. That's really useful for, as I said, reusable components. But props are read-only and they should never be modified by the component they're rendered in. So inside that button component or welcome component, you wouldn't want to add something to your props. You wouldn't want to say like props.name equals something other than what you passed in.
So where are you doing that?
Where
are you declaring what props equal?
On the welcome component here, the name, and then that gets passed into props.name. See that? Okay. And then down here in the button component, also you can pass props in as inline style attributes. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. And then, but if you can't change your props, then you might ask, what's the whole point of React and how can you update your components over time? That's where state comes in. And state allows us to update our components in response to user actions, network requests, and anything else. So component state is actually not the best example. When we switch over to the demo site, I can show you a better example there. But state gives us, hold on, let's go back one. This is a stateless functional component. So there are two types of components in React: stateless, functional, and a class-based component. Class-based components give you access to things like state and lifecycle methods. Stateless functional components are just that, JavaScript functions that return HTML. So in our stateful or class-based component here, we can access state, and like I said, that we can update over time. And you can think of state as like a local variable to a function. State cannot be accessed or modified outside of that component and can only ever be accessed from within that component.
So it kind of like replaces like let, like make it static to just that function.
Replaces let, the
like
variable keyword?
Yeah.
Let me think about that. I guess it would be like if you wrote a JavaScript function with a variable inside of it, you're not going to be able to access that outside, right?
It's only
Yeah, it's locally scoped to that component. But if you have a child component in that component, you can pass your state as props to that component, which we'll look at in a little bit. So the behavior of the component is tracked and manipulated through state. So if you were to change a button, component state from on to off, React will detect the state change, re-render the button component, and it could be displayed in maybe a different color with different markup depending on its state. And React says if your component has a constructor function, the props should always be passed to the constructor and also to the super method. I don't know that they tell you why, but they just tell you to. So we do that. And in our stateful class-based components, we also have lifecycle methods like component did mount and component will unmount. These are things like when the component gets rendered to the DOM or when you switch a page and it gets taken off of the DOM. There's also the render method here. Actually, we don't have that here. But the render method gets called anytime state or props is updated or changes. And you should not use set state in your render method, which we'll also look at here soon. The component did mount happens, like I said, as soon as it's mounted to the DOM, and that's usually a good place to make an HTTP request to set up your initial state or get data from Drupal settings. Another common lifecycle method is component did update, and this method is invoked as soon as the updating begins. The most common use case for this is updating the DOM in response to props or state changes. You can call set state in this method, but you should wrap it in a conditional, otherwise you can end up in an infinite loop if you don't check that the current state is different from the previous state. Alright, so JSX. Like I said, JSX is a syntax extension of JavaScript. It stands for JavaScript XML. Makes it easier to read and write React code. It's not required by React, but it's much more efficient and easier to use. And at the end of the day, it gets translated back into regular React code. As you can see here, the top is JSX. You get a very nicely put in H1 tag with content in it. And then when React renders it, it'll come out like the bottom one there. But with JSX, you don't have to write it like that.
Is that like a separate package?
It comes with React.
Okay.
And as you can see on the H1, it's using class name instead of class. And that's because class is a reserved keyword in React and should only be used when you're creating a class-based component. All right. So that was, let's just look at some actual React code. So here, I put together a little demo site. These are just two event content types to look at. Alright, so here is our React calendar component, and then here we have an event list React component. And we'll take a look at both of these here. Alright, to start, this is our root component and is actually the only one we render to the DOM through React DOM.render app component, and then we render that to this React block that gets placed somewhere right there. Okay, hold on. Sorry, this is going terribly. But how I did this was I created a custom Drupal module here in the modules custom folder. I just called it React block. Inside of there I have an app folder which contains all my React code and Sass. And then outside of the app folder is a, where did that go? Actually inside the app folder, sorry, is a Webpack config file, which I didn't write this file, I actually just found it and had it work, which before having this Webpack file, I had to write all my React in one file, but that's not typically how you'll write React. You'll want to split things up like calendar.js for your calendar component or event card for your event cards components. So this Webpack config allows us to do that.
What did you use to build the boilerplate for your custom module? Just Drupal console, or is it does the?
I think just Drupal generate module.
Okay.
Yeah, and then that gave me just this simple info file, libraries. Oh yeah, and then in your libraries, you'll want to, so this Webpack file looks in our app, or it's already in app, but it takes our JavaScript, all of our JavaScript files here, and all of our Sass files here, and moves them outside of app into JS, bundle, and CSS. And then we just load those two files into our module. But here we have this is our root React app component. And hold on, actually, let's go back here. Sorry about that.
And in your SRC is the module file, the block.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, let's take a quick look at that. So in SRC we have plugin block like you would in any other Drupal module. That's a block, and that just returns one markup string, which is a div with an ID, and then attaches the library. And then from there we can place our block like I did here. You go and install the module, and then place your block. And here I actually have it restricted to these two pages. And I wanted different React components on different pages without having to like install this module multiple times or something. So in my React code here, I said if page ID, and this is just the body class list. So if you look up here, should be a page or node ID somewhere in here. Basically here I'm just saying if we're on page 1, give me the calendar component. If we're on page 2, give me the event list component. And that's pretty useful because you can place the block in multiple places, and then instead of rendering the same React app everywhere, you can have different components on different pages, kind of like we do here. This page is all React. I just hid the sidebars for this page, but on this half React page, we still have our normal Drupal sidebars, but we also have this React component. In our calendar, let's look at that. That's where we have state. This is a class-based component. And the state here is for this modal field. So we can click on the calendar to create an event, and we'll just call this super cool event. It's at 3:30 p.m. with some random description. Create it, and that actually went to our database and created a node. So if you see here, we now have a new event without ever having a page reload.
How do you do that?
How?
Yeah, that's
It was fun.
So something I'm struggling with right now is updating. So we have a paragraphs module installed, right? Which I think we all know what paragraphs are. So what I'm trying to do with paragraphs is change, like give a facelift to the UI experience, which looks like that's what you're doing, right?
Yeah.
So how do we do that? Like, what's the process in Drupal land to decouple the original Drupal experience?
Okay, very good question.
It's both, right? You need probably a little bit of both, right? Back end to handle the form in some way, and then front end to.
I think you guys came in right after I was talking about the two required modules for Drupal and React. You need views and RESTful web services enabled. So we'll take a look at these real quick. Views, are you guys familiar with views?
Yeah.
And what about the REST module?
Yeah.
Okay. So those basically just allow us to go in here, create a view, and export it as an API. So if we were to go here and just type in API/events, it's just JSON. And then in our React, we go All right. So this actions folder and this reducers folder, these are Redux, which this kind of probably should have had a normal React example. But anyways, you just write a Axios or JavaScript fetch or what is it, jQuery Ajax GET request to that API. So localhost API/events, and that gets all the JSON data.
For authenticated requests here, do you have to get and manage the tokens, or does the framework take care of the
Up here,
authenticating the token?
we have
okay.
it's actually in our view, we can set up a basic auth or a cookie authentication. And then whatever we have set here will be required by the Drupal or by the React app. And for the GET requests, since this is just a local site, I didn't care to set up any authentication for that. But post and delete requests do require a token no matter what.
But you have a function here to get that token,
Mhm.
and then all your other functions have to use the token you fetched.
Yes.
Gotcha.
And you can do that by passing the token in headers here. Sorry. So our get events function just hits that API, gets all that JSON data, and passes it. It actually dispatches it to our reducers function here, which then, oh man, sorry guys, I didn't think about the workflow of this, but let's actually just go look at a little bit of Redux, so that way these actions and reducers make sense. So Redux has actions and reducers. It's a global state container for JavaScript apps. It tries to separate the application data and business logic into its own container so that React can just manage the view. So that's why you see all of our HTTP requests and state management stuff is done in our actions and reducers, because say maybe we come back in the future and we wanted to swap this out for a view library instead of React. All of our business logic and data is going to be in Redux, and we wouldn't have to go rewrite it because we could use Redux with Vue or with Angular. Redux might seem a little overkill for small applications, but it scales really well if you are building something large, and it also comes with really good developer tools, as you can see here. Go to Redux. This is what's happening when alright, our calendar component, when it mounts to the DOM, it runs this props get events, which is the get events function from our actions. And that, all right, let me rethink that. The calendar component gets mounted to the DOM, and it calls our get events function, which then passes the HTTP request's data to state through the reducer, which we just assign to an events array. So in our Redux store, we have this events array, which is just a bunch of event objects. Is everyone confused? I am. And then like I said, for the post requests, you also have to have the token. Before we look at all the HTTP stuff anymore, though, let's just look at state and props a little bit. This is not a good one. Our event list uses props pretty good because our event list renders our event card component multiple times, and it passes in key, ID, title, image as props. And then in our event card, we access those props right here, like this.props.title, props body, ID, and image. And that allows us to just create the React card component once and render it multiple times. Here, we just loop through the events array, and for every event, we create a React card, pass in its data, and that's what gives us this view here. And no, that's so props sound good. Being able to pass the data into the children components and then rendering that markup. Where to go next? And in our calendar component, we have a good example of state, because that's where we have modal is by default set to false. But down here we have a handle date click function, which sets modal to whatever it is not currently. So right now, this new state, modal is true and modal is false. And in our state, we also have the title, time, image, and description, which we assign, or which we bind to an onChange function and an onSubmit function for when we're modifying and modifying and submitting the form. On our individual input components, we have to let's go here back to our onChange. So onChange just takes in the event and it sets the event target name to the event target value. Or it looks for event target name and sets it to event target value, and sets the state here to whatever that value is. So down here on our input components, we have a name and value. Name's title, the value is this.state.title, and then we apply our onChange function. So if we let's look at console log. So if we were to console log our state, and then remember our render method gets called anytime state changes. So if we start typing here, you'll see state is changing. Anything you type in here, just super cool event again. And how our onChange method is set up with the event target name and event target value allows us to just have one onChange function that handles all inputs versus a handle name change, handle description change, because down here you can see that one onChange function is updating the state for any of these inputs. And then our onSubmit function will prevents default, because by default a form submission reloads the page. And here we actually take all of that data on state and we format it for how Drupal wants it, with this links types href to rest type node. And that first we have to set up here. Under another module you'll need is the REST UI, unless you want to just write everything or write this type of stuff in PHP, but this makes it much easier. So here you basically just look through and see what you want to. I'm sure if you have paragraphs installed, there will be a paragraphs thing here. But for me, I just did content node. I'm allowing get, post, and delete requests with these accepted data formats and these accepted authentications. So Drupal wants that data to come in like this. Everything as an object with this is just the machine name, field image, field date. I'm sure you've seen that. And then what we do, so we create this event object and we pass it to this.props.addEvent, which here fires an HTTP request to right here, node/post, or actually just /node. So we're writing our post request here. And if you notice here, I'm using Axios get. Axios is typically what you'll use with React, but for the post and delete requests, it wasn't working for me, so I just went with the default JavaScript fetch method. And I think that's because I pass in same origin here. So
I got a question.
not sure.
So it looks like here you know the schema, the data schema or model. Like you know there's a title field, body, whatever. But with paragraphs, you don't really know. It depends on which paragraph they select. So how would you make this more dynamic? Like, is that even possible? Where you cannot know what the fields are, but somehow still display them? And
I think you would need to know the fields,
yeah.
but those would just be under your structure, paragraph types, and then the layout, right?
So yeah, would you have to write controllers for every single paragraph?
I believe so.
That's not very good.
You might be able to abstract out the
Yeah.
names of fields.
Might be able
and
to.
type what they are, and then like dynamically build the format. That's a lot going to be a lot more difficult than what than essentially hard coding them like
But it
this.
is possible. I see what you're saying.
It could be.
Yeah, if you start doing one and then you do the next one, by the third one, you're going to know exactly what you can and can't abstract out,
Yeah.
and what you're going to wind up as being your edge cases.
All right. So for our post requests, like I said, we needed this headers to be passed in. And if you look at the REST modules, documentation and API, they cover all that. We send a post request to our Drupal API, then we return the JSON data, and actually we have a console log of that data here. So just take a look at that. That's what D there. So this is what the post request to Drupal returns to us. And this full calendar component doesn't take the same data that Drupal, or the same format that Drupal wants. So I just had to kind of reformat everything here again to have things show up properly on the calendar, but they would show up just fine here. And again, that just dispatches our add event action to our reducer, which then takes our current state. You guys know about, what's this, the spread operator? Spread operator, I believe, takes, actually what we're doing here is taking our current state and just outputting it and then adding to it without modifying it, or creating a new copy of it, I guess. Yeah, spread operator creates a new copy of your current state, or whatever array or object you're using. And after we submit the form, we just set state back to empty strings. And then our full calendar, no. On our form, we just have at the top on submit equals this .onSubmit, which is our function we created here. And then our button, just type submit. Another thing when you're using React and Redux, you need to connect your functions to, or connect your components to Redux. Otherwise, you won't have access to any of the actions or reducers. So you'll see in almost all of these, export default, connect map state to props. You don't need map state to props if you don't need your global Redux store like here. But I think for this we did for all of these. Maybe not this one. I guess we did. But then also we have delete requests. So if we hit this delete button, it'll delete that node without a page reload. We can go here, see that node's no longer load. Is there two? Okay. So yeah, we can post and delete to Drupal without page refreshes with that. Let's go back to some Redux and take a look at the actions. So actions are just payloads of data that you send from your application to your store. They're the only source of information for the store, and then you send them to Redux using the dispatch method, which is a little bit different here than how we have it. I'm gonna try to get this module up on the marketplace, so that way it'll be just kind of a sandbox you can download and mess around with and get familiar with React and stuff without having to go through all this initial setup. And it'll have the Redux with it. So I think that'll be really helpful. But about that. So actions are just plain JavaScript objects, and they take in that have a type property that indicates the type of action being performed, like we see here. Type an add event or type delete event. And other than the type, you can pass anything you want to a action. Here they have text, but I typically always just use payload, and you can pass multiple things here if you wanted. Let's just say events, but like I said, I always just typically use payload, and then in your reducer is where you get the action.payload. And this is just a switch statement that says if the action is get token, then do this. If the action is get events, do this. And so the actions are what handle our HTTP requests, and then they dispatch those responses to the reducers, and the reducers then set our global Redux state, and then our components can access that Redux state through the connect method. Like that. Does that kind of make sense? Cool. So for the GET requests, the GET events one, we can actually just do that with views and the REST web services module, but to do the post and delete requests, you'll need the REST UI, so you can set up those other endpoints, because with an exported view, you can only send GET requests, which we kind of looked at enabling those endpoints. I couldn't get anything to work with just a normal JSON format, so I actually used HAL JSON. I have no idea what it is. This right here, how to create node in this blog, was really helpful for the post request and I guess just a post request. So I would recommend checking that out. My very much recommended places to learn React are going to be Traversy Media or Academind on YouTube, because YouTube's free and it's awesome. They're both really good channels. They cover a wide variety of topics, from HTML, CSS basics to like building full stack applications, where you kind of just watch their video and you code along with them, and through that React will make a little more sense. They also have very good just other tutorials and stuff on there. Both of these instructors have accounts on Udemy where they sell courses, which Udemy is one of my second favorite places to learn, because there's almost always a sale going on for like $10 to $15 courses, so check those out. But I would start with YouTube because, like I said, it's free and they're good channels. Any questions? Any parts of the React code anyone wants to take a deeper look at that I might have just
Can we
blew
inspect
over?
your element on the calendar?
Yeah.
One that has a event.
Like one of these?
Yeah. I just want to see what's being rendered.
And this is actually the full calendar component from here. It's just like an additional JavaScript library, but they have a React integration or React component. So that's where I got the documentation for this. And they tell you how the data should be formatted for events. But so none of this markup I wrote. This is all to create this calendar. The only code that I wrote was this here. So just that little bit right there made all that. And another cool thing about React, or even let's look at for this modal, these buttons, how they have this little hover effect, and there's a kind of there might not be a ripple effect. But anyways, this modal and all the buttons and these cards, I actually just used from React, or Material Design for Bootstrap, React version. So this gives you like really nice pre-built components like buttons and stuff. These are all like pre-styled, they're functional, and how you use those would be, let's look at the event card. You just run here, like npm install -- save material design bootstrap React, which they'll tell you on the site how you can install it. And then you import the whatever components you need, like here. And then down here, we can just use all these pre-built components that are really nicely styled and whatnot. It's there's a lot more to learn about React, so very much recommend one of those YouTube channels. Or
is there a particular reason you use React with Drupal over, say, like Angular or Vue? Or is that just personal preference?
Just personal preference.
Okay.
There's probably some cases where I would use Angular, like maybe in a larger scale application.
Okay.
But this just being, two pretty simple, small, lightweight components, figured React was best. And React is just, it's a library, not a framework, so it's more lightweight than Angular. I guess Vue would also be good here.
Okay. So I'm more familiar with Vue, and I was just wondering if there was a particular reason. But thank you.
No reason.
I also use MDB whenever I work on with Vue.
It's great, isn't it?
Yeah, it's amazing. They have great tutorials.
Everyone got the YouTube channels or know where to learn React?
In this particular example, you used a block, but could you use a page that could build a controller instead? How would that be different?
So I think if you were to use a controller, you could actually set up like a route on your site, so maybe /React, and then you can use React router, which would go in your root component. Instead of doing this conditional, we would just say like, we would get rid of this. Oh yeah, also the Redux gives you this provider component, which you have to wrap your entire app with to have access to that global store. But if we were to go the route of a Drupal controller instead of a block, and we had React router, it would look something like this. React router, route. Path equals / and component equals calendar. We'll just call this like page 2. So if you went with a calendar, a controller, sorry, I can't see that. If you went with a controller, you could use React Router to actually switch the page without a refresh, but it would have to live after whatever route you set up in the controller. Is anyone familiar with Drupal controllers?
So what would be the advantages or disadvantages of one approach versus the other?
I think with the block module, the advantage is being able to go into your block layout and render it on different pages, with like working with this type of if-else here to render. So then you can have one module that gives you different React components on different pages. But if you were to go, or different Drupal pages, I guess. But if you were to go the route of a controller, then all your React stuff's gonna just live on that React page. But you could also just get rid of the header and the footer and just have that controller be your whole entire page and create your header and footer in React.
There's a couple other circumstances I could see where you would want to make sure and render your output in the controller, versus just going straight React. Because like accessibility, number one, with JavaScript is disabled, what you do. Your site still needs a display. Two, you would have input, like output on your page already. So if something does go wrong with your JavaScript application, say, oh, your client's ads break the page for some reason, you still have content. And you're not waiting, sitting there perpetually waiting.
Going the route of a block or
Either
controller?
way.
Mhm.
Yeah. As long as you have output first, that's stationary, so a placeholder, and then update it with React afterwards.
Mhm. Any other questions, concerns, comments? And I'm going to try to get this as just like a scaffolding or sandbox module on the marketplace. So hopefully soon you'll be able to just go download it, have all this set up ready to go, and you can just hop in, start creating components here and creating React files. Another cool thing is, say we go here, we'll just make a new component. If you want a functional component, actually, before I say that, you need React Redux snippets for VS Code, but you can just do RFC, and that'll create you a functional component.
Yeah.
Or you can do RCC to create a class-based component. And that saves you a little bit of setup time. So, recommend that
Is that
extension.
the only VS Code plugin you have for React?
I use Prettier, which you probably just use for any CSS, but that also works really well with JSX. Yeah, I think that's the only React extension I have. Oh, maybe it was this one. It's this one. So just a quick recap of the components, or Redux working with React, I guess. Components will fire your actions, or, sorry, I'm trying to think about how to explain that. In your component, you'll use a lifecycle method to call an action function, which then dispatches the action to the reducer, which sets the Redux store, which then you can connect to from your component. And map state to props.